Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek. Hello, everybody. I'm Natasha Helfer. I'm a therapist, relational and sex. This is my podcast where we try to attack shame and get healthier through education, stories, relationships, all the things. And I have gathered what I think is a phenomenal panel of therapists and professionals to discuss the big hubbubaloo that has definitely taken over, at least here in the state of Utah, which is this case of Jodi Hildebrandt and Ruby Franke, one of whom is or has been a professional in the past as far as in our field, and Ruby Franke more of like an influencer, and then kind of entering kind of this coaching kind of space that's highly unregulated, which we'll talk about a little bit today. So that's the topic. We have lots to say about it, but I would love to give each of my panelists just a quick chance to introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about who they are, where you can find them, and what they're up to these days. So Dr. Hanks, do you mind starting us off?
Yeah, I'm Dr. Julie Hanks. I am a licensed clinical social worker and owner of Wasatch Family Therapy Clinics in Utah and Mesa, Arizona. And I'm an author, social media lover, influencer. I have my own podcast, Ask Dr. Julie Hanks. And I'm at Dr. Julie Hanks on social media and my website.
Perfect. Thank you. She's definitely worth following. So do that. And I have Amy Heffernan, who is a dear friend and colleague of mine as well. What are you up to, Amy?
Well, I have been doing marriage and family therapy for 15 years and then sex therapy for the last probably 10 years and up in Seattle. And then the pandemic hit and I was one of the first responders that took a hit and needed to take a break. And so I have been on a break. So I am actually wanting to model ethical behavior and say, I'm actually not licensed right now because I'm still figuring out what's next. And I think that's going to circle back around later, but I just at least wanted to start with that to say, why does it matter that we have licenses? What does that mean? All of that kind of issues that are presented here with this case. But in my core, a systems therapist, deeply inside of myself, I have probably through my whole career had at least 40 to 50% of my population be people from the LDS background and or they would identify as Mormon. And I want to be very specific with how I'm going to use those words today, because on a cultural level, I still think a lot of people, ex-Mormon, post-Mormon, progressive Mormon, there's a lot of identity with that word. And so I don't want to say that word in an offensive way. I want to be very clear about how I'm using that word in a cultural way, because there's a lot of people that identify with that word. But when I'm going to be talking about active LDS people, I will be using the word LDS people. But when I'm going to be talking in a cultural context, I might use the word Mormon. So I just at least wanted to say that. But in my scope of years of being a human, I have had many, many exposures to Mormon people, LDS people. Obviously, I niched, and now I have been spending years in the wound of and the joy and of all the things that come with sexuality and Mormonism. And so that is a niche. I've really spent a lot of time hanging with that, wound, I would say, in our culture. Also beautiful things that have come from that in our culture too. So I don't want to say either one, there's light and shadow to everything, but it's a niche of human experience that I've spent a lot of time talking about, hearing about. If you unzipped me, there would be stories spilling out of me related to this stuff. So I care about this group of humans. It's deep inside me. It's an ancestral thing. It's generational. It's a group of humans I deeply care about. So when I hear about therapists that are serving this population also, and the impact of what, I see as my siblings of profession, what we're doing out here, I care about it deeply. And so this is something that speaks to me personally as the self of the therapist, but collectively as a culture of Mormon and active LDS people and everybody in that whole range of humans that I feel like I've served through my whole career. it's something I feel passionate about. So ethical practice, ethical space holding is like something that I could get on a soapbox about. And I'm sure that's why Natasha wanted me today. So hello. And I want to say that everything from here on out that I say is just like the cult of Amy Heff. And so take it or leave it. You don't have to agree with me. And I want to practice differentiation right off the start. So here we are. Welcome to me. Thanks, Natasha.
I love it. This is exactly why I brought Amy on, because she is very passionate. All right. Claire Melenthin, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Please introduce yourself.
It gets butchered all the time. I answer to lots of it.
So tell us all about you.
So I'm Claire Melenthin, and I am it doesn't sound anything like it's spelled. Don't worry. I get called all sorts of things when I'm being introduced. Luckily, most of it's nice, but I'm the director of child and adolescent services at Wasatch Family Therapy, and I've been there for almost 16 years now, and really building up the child and family aspect to the clinic. And I've been in the field of social work for 23 years, and I've been a registered play therapist supervisor for almost the past 20, getting close to 20. So my specialty areas is children and families, especially working with trauma and attachment issues. And so, many of the kids that I work with, have experienced different layers of trauma in their life. And working with the families, is my passion. I just absolutely love it. So I've published extensively, written several books, have a website out there with a blog for parents at clairemelenthin.com. And COVID did lots of crazy things to lots of us. And I thought it was a great time to jump into a doctoral program because, why not add that to my life? It's just a little something to add in there. So getting close to the finish line with that as well. And it is always a fun adventure over here. So.
Okay, perfect. And we're going to make sure and link to all of these spaces where you can find these amazing humans who've been doing the work and doing it, in my opinion, very well. So, and just to give a little bit context of me, I have worked, as a sex therapist, as a relationship therapist, also primarily within the context of religiously conservative communities. So I come from the Mormon kind of experience as well. I feel very similarly to Amy about the language. There are many people who definitely want to be called Latter-day Saints and to be honored in that way. There are even believing active people of the church who do not want to be called that. So it gets a little tricky as far as, making sure everybody feels honored and accepted. And of course, there's many people that come from the tradition or who have left the tradition who do not resonate with the term Latter-day Saint at all. So we do want to be inclusive of all those terms, and hopefully you'll bear with us as we're trying to even figure that out culturally, I think, in the current in the current MO of our spaces. But I specifically chose Amy because she brings this sex therapy expertise. I specifically chose Claire because she brings this child and adolescent expertise. And I brought Julie on specifically because she does do this really lovely job of interweaving therapeutic practice with a lot of her followers and a lot of her clientele who do happen to come from kind of our religious culture. So that's what we're talking about, even though we will probably be focusing mostly on Latter-day Saint and Mormon language and communities. I also spent a huge amount of my professional career in Wichita, Kansas, right in the middle of the Bible Belt. So I'm very aware that these issues do not just hit our population. So many of the issues that we'll be talking about today will be kind of wide in that way. So let's just start off by, I'd like to just get kind of a general initial response as you have looked at the news and listened to maybe some of the podcasts or done some of this, wherever you've been hearing about this story, maybe what your first professional and even personal impressions were. And I'll just let you all fight for whoever wants to go first.
Well, I think as a child therapist, this has been an ongoing thing that Julie and I have talked about for a long time about sharing, Julie sharing concerns, because Julie's always in the know of what's happening on social media, much more than I am. But, this finding out more and more about the parenting techniques that were being shared and promoted And then, as a child therapist, especially one who specializes in trauma and attachment issues, like it hurts my heart for what these kids have been taught, how they've been treated, what they've been shown their worth to be and their value in their homes. And, this week in the court hearing with Ruby Frank making this big disclosure and blaming her children for her actions and saying that she only did it because now her son is a sexual abuser and, her very minor child, and has publicly outed him as that, resulting in him now being placed by himself and further as traumatized. Now all 4 minor children are in the care of DCFS since this week and separated. So the layers upon layers upon layers upon layers of trauma that these kids are going to have to work through in their life is just heartbreaking. And I think, there's also that other part of me, like on the flip side of just feeling sad for the adults, like truly like just feeling sad for them, because I really believe, and in my clinical experience, like parents come with such good intent. And like usually the intent, even behind atrocious behaviors of parenting, is I'm trying in my own, sometimes very twisted way to keep you safe or to protect you in somehow, even if I'm the one causing the most pain. And so like there's that part of me that does actually feel a lot of compassion underneath the outrage and the disgust, but it's just heartbreaking that this whole system has been developed and created and then being perpetuated across, having so many followers, which is the other part of that, where there's like hundreds of thousands of parents listening to these 2 women being like, oh, that's a good idea, I should do that to my kids. And it's heartbreaking looking at, again, just systemically, like how far out this trickle out effect potentially is.
Thank you. I'm going to definitely come back to some of the points that you made. Amy, I think I saw you unmute yourself.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I think my initial reaction is one of that where you think about the bad apples, right? Like in any time, in any profession, when there is something that bubbles up that puts someone in the spotlight. And so in this case, you have to look and say, okay, how do we look at our systemic dynamics as a profession? What are we holding each other accountable? Because that is why licensing matters. Okay, this is what I was going to say earlier. There is something to say about what it means to be a licensed practitioner. There are people that are the watchdogs to make sure that we have therapists that are practicing ethically. We are required by law to go and do ethical training so that we can continue to talk and discuss about the complications of sometimes the ethical things that happen. So when I first started to hear it, like what ends up coming is like all the ethical things that hurt my ears. And I'm like, like, I mean, just the children alone, the ethical the complications and dynamics that I can see are playing out, and that what I know to be accountable to what is our job as a therapist, right? So I think what it does is it stirs all that up in me. It stirs all that, hey, how do we take accountability for ways in which our community might not be showing up the best way? Because we are the ones that need to hold each other accountable. And so these are the kind of situations that I think create this lovely discussions for us to say, how do we continue to like aim for the best practices, and how do we make sure that the outliers that are creating huge impacts, that are spreading information that continue to create harm on like generational trauma, it just continues to go on. And when you're trying to like, put a hole over the dam, that's just like, it feels exhausting. So I think it sometimes speaks to my, my passion for this profession, and also the complicated, ever-changing dynamics that we always have to be in conversation about. So yeah. I like when things get highlighted in the news, because it helps us all look in the mirror and say, how are we showing up as a community with each other?
Thank you. Julie, your initial thoughts as this story broke.
Yeah. So I've actually been following Connections and Moms of Truth for a little over a year, I think, with serious concerns. And some of the things that especially Jodi Hildebrandt had posted online that are transphobic, xenophobic, homophobic, sexist. I actually reported her to DOPL in Utah a couple of months ago because I was concerned, and they came back and said, well, it's not with a client, so there's really nothing we can do. But my understanding was that we have as licensed, she's still licensed, even though she was practicing recently as a coach, she still holds a license as a clinical mental health counselor. And so my feeling is that we are still bound by our ethical obligations, even when we're just interacting with people, with the community, making public statements. Like, I take that seriously in my social media work, that things are still ethically in line. And my assessment was she was way over the line, and particularly saying disparaging things about vulnerable populations. In every mental health professional ethics, there is an emphasis on protecting vulnerable, marginalized populations. And so that was my biggest concern. And then I kind of got into more of Ruby Frankie's parenting or just family vlog and things like that. And there were lots of concerning things. But my biggest concern was a fellow professional saying things that are damaging to other human beings, especially marginalized populations. So this has been on my radar, and I've just had this gut feeling like something is not right here. And then I recently learned that Jodi Hildebrandt was Chad's therapist. I hadn't seen that video clip where he talks about her as his therapist. And so, then we get into a lot of other ethical concerns, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yes, right. Oh my goodness, the directions I could go right now with everything you've all just shared. Is the part. Where do I want to lead the conversation? So let's start with this idea of licenses. And actually, that's really concerning what you just shared, Julie, right? That you actually called, the few times I've called about, colleagues where I felt there was unethical behavior, it was more in the context of within their clinical space and something they had done with a client. So, but what you're saying is that here you're running into all of this, kind of information and misinformation and unethical and biased, discriminatory views that of course we know affect how Jodi would show up with clients, right? You don't have to make a lot of jumps of the hoops there. And yet they're saying, well, there wasn't anything we could do because there wasn't a formal complaint by a client themselves. So that's really concerning. Like, what are the standards of our regulatory boards, which now makes me want to go to their board meeting.
Right.
I want to attend all the board meetings.
Another concern that I had was that Ruby, who is acting as a mental fitness trainer, who's certified by Jodi or trained by Jodi, is giving advice on serious mental health conditions like eating disorders, and giving very harmful, not evidence-based advice on mental health disorders, and she has no credential. So that was also concerning. But there's no such thing really as a mental fitness trainer. That's like made up term by them. So there's no board to report or to say that this is concerning when someone who has no background in mental health is giving mental health serious, like eating disorders have the highest mortality rate of any mental health disorder, is my understanding. So it's like, this is serious life and death kind of concerns.
But Jodi was also giving similar advice as a mental health expert and saying that it's a distortion and you need to parent with truth. So there's no such thing as rape. There's no such thing as ADHD. There's no such thing as, physical or mental or emotional challenges. It's a distortion. And so you have that twofold with that of both of them like promulgating just so much misinformation to their followers about like what is real and what, what conditions humans actually do go through. And it's not a distortion or a truth. It just is. So I think that, with that, Julie, I mean, it's the double whammy of that, let alone moving in with your patient and their parents. So that's another, just little thing.
Just a little thing.
Yeah.
Amy.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ethical violations that we just like casually brushed over. Okay, so my hair could start on fire with just a few of those. Like, we know ethically we have to always be consciously thinking about the boundary between where we begin and our client, where we end and our client begins. Like, this is something that it's a muscle that you have to learn over the years of, like, how do you keep that boundary? And then when you couple then like the social media on top of that, with like people are thinking, like therapists that are trained, you have to be thinking about really intentionality of the accountability that you have to the power of the words that are coming out of your mouth as someone that is licensed as anything, and so the power of the words and the influence of those words being a mental health therapist, but then really having no checks and balances about a mental fitness trainer, like that's not a thing, but yet it's being propped up as a valid argument, and that's very frustrating for people that are trying to really do work around how to heal vulnerable communities. So it gets that mama bear protective energy that, that I feel the fire inside. So yes.
Right. I mean, ideally, the way that we're trained, which I think all of us have to work on this, but anybody from any background, from any culture, from any religion, from any race, any gender, should be able to walk into an office and be met with curiosity, validity, correct information, and, cultural sensitivity, right? These are like basic values. So when you are, for example, sharing, like Julie said, xenophobic or racist or sexist views to the public, right? Then already you are downplaying who's going to feel safe in your office. Now, I think it is hard to have everybody feel safe in our offices. That's a difficult thing, but this is like taking it to a whole nother level. So I want to next move forward to what you just said, Amy, as far as vulnerability. Why are certain populations vulnerable? So my take on this, and this is kind of with my bias of having worked with so many religious folks, and I want to clarify, religious folks from high demand, maybe more conservative or strict religions, because not all religion is the same, nor are the values of all religions the same. But historically, there seems to be a historical component that high demand religions and the field of psychotherapy have not always been BFFs, right? We've not always gotten along. And I think a lot of times seeing a psychologist or a therapist or a mental health practitioner is seen as maybe against some of those values within a high faith community. For example, if you have a problem over here in the church world, you pray about it, you repent, you go to church, you talk to your ecclesiastical leader. Like, these are kind of some of the solutions that these high demand religious spaces will offer their folks. And we know through the research that many spiritual practices, even in high demand religions, are actually very useful. So it's not black and white. I'm just saying that's kind of the direction that they're led. And sometimes some ecclesiastical leaders, and we have this even today in a lot of the Bible Belt land, it will actually speak against mental health. Like, you shouldn't go see a therapist. You shouldn't trust a therapist. They're woke, or they're this, or they're that, or they're going to give you information that would go against your standards of practice in this faith community. And then over here in psychotherapy land, you have a lot of like values around self-determination, around exploration, around evidence-based practice. So even if it doesn't fit with a certain religious construct, evidence-based practice doesn't really care about that. It's just trying to figure out, is it evidence-based or not? So in my view, that's what makes some of these populations vulnerable, and why I have cared so much about my LDS community, because I have seen this in action for decades, right? Where I feel like therapists who don't know how to watch their religious bias will bring their religious ideas and sprinkle it with psychotherapy. and then all of a sudden you have some some methods, some methodology, and some practices that would fall under our concern of unethical practice. So, what are your thoughts about vulnerabilities? Who is vulnerable? Why are we vulnerable?
I think, one of the things that I see in my work, and have seen just, being in the field for as long as I've been in, is when there is high shame-based culture, that creates a level of vulnerability in and of itself. And then you talk about, just looking at that from like a systemic lens of like access to resources, access to outside information, access to the world around you. All of those layers upon layers upon layers create vulnerability. And I think that, in looking at kind of going back to this case, the therapist created this vulnerability within her clientele, right? Like, you need to listen to me because I know what's best. And I'm not trying to create this mom as a victim, but there is a level of victimhood for everybody, I think, in this case, unfortunately. But you have a hurting parent who is scared and ashamed, and their kids are not doing the things that, in their worldview of like what you're supposed to be doing. And so they're seeking out somebody better able, more capable, more knowledgeable than they are. That's why people come to therapy if it's not mandated, right? It's a seeking out of support and help, and then trusting wholeheartedly in what this person is telling you to do, because you've created this dynamic of, I'm better able, more knowledgeable, more educated, so listen to me. And then that creates this power differential, which, again, going back to what we were talking about with ethics, then you have them going into business together and then moving in together, and all of these layers upon layers upon layers of ethical issues are happening. But it's within this vulnerability framework. And I think the shame-based framework, which is so interesting, to think about it in those light, because they put their world on for the world to see and have comments about. But I think inherent underneath all of that grandiosity is there's that piece of, I'm afraid, I don't know what to do, I need some help. And being in that vulnerable, fragile place as a parent, there's not a worse place to find yourself in. It'd be so great if we could bubble wrap our kids from themselves and their choices, and, and every just life that they have to go through. And so I think that you have, all of these elements coming in. Because it's easy to kind of be dismissive of this case of like, oh, they're white, they have access to resources, they have access to money, they're, totally, exploiting their kids for their millions of dollars on YouTube. Like, it's easy to just kind of dismiss all the other layers of stuff that are underneath that. I think that iceberg analogy is so, impactful, when we're looking at any systems that get so convoluted and disrupted.
Thank you. Yeah, that's excellent. Who else has thoughts about vulnerabilities?
I think part of the vulnerability of anyone involved in Mormon culture is the focus on external authority, that the answers are outside of you. Somebody else knows better. And then you couple that, with kind of lack of self-development, especially for women. You women exist to serve, to take care of, to nurture, to support. And I think that leaves women in particular vulnerable, because many of them haven't developed a sense of self that's independent or differentiated from the other authority figures around them or their familial relationships. And so it's kind of like, help, like Claire was saying, somebody help me, because I don't know what's right or wrong, good or bad. Someone please tell me. And it's in going through Jodi's videos and the things that they teach through their Connections program, it's basically uber orthodox Mormonism repackaged, right? And very binary, black and white. There's only truth and distortion. That's it, right? Good and evil. We've heard. So it's kind of repackaged, kind of taking the orthodox view and then making it seem like it's coaching or something like that, when it's really just rigid dogma.
Well, in which I will add to that vulnerability then, because if you are listening to ecclesiastical leaders and prophets and pastors or whomever it is that you would find, in essence, an authority that you trust. And then you have these mental health therapists and coaches taking a version of that you hear at church and now making it sound clinical and sound and wise. You can see how that's part of that vulnerability, because you trust your church leaders. And so why wouldn't I trust a clinician who basically parrots in their own way what the church leader is saying? And by the way, if you're not watching this video or this podcast, try to go watch it on YouTube, because just watching Amy Heffernan's reactions is just adds to the beautiful experience. But Amy, what would you say about vulnerabilities?
Okay, well, I want to just like this is such a beautiful building, because this external. Okay, so first Claire talks about this authority thing, this like this hierarchy, right? This out of alignment. It's one person's higher than the other. Okay, so that's deeply rooted in like how we're born into the download of this culture, right? And then Julie comes beautifully in with like talking about the external authority that we give away. So even in parenting, there's this like, well, I guess our kids aren't supposed to date till we're 16. So naturally in the system, there's this a revering of authority and giving away your own internal authority to have that external authority. Okay. So then here I'm coming with then the sex. Okay. So then we're like, okay, now someone that has had saying, we're a little bit developmentally behind on knowing your own internal authority about your own pleasures, your own things that you like, what you don't like, your yucks and yums and all those things, because the developmentally thing, it was kind of like, oh, someone was telling me all along all the things. And so trying to like grow into yourself sexually, you're very vulnerable. And so I as a sex therapist, I've had to know there's very vulnerable people that are saying, Amy, tell me what's next for me. Tell me, like, you're the sexpert. Tell me, should I masturbate? How many times a day is okay? How many is it okay to look at the JCPenney things? Like, tell me what's okay now. And it's like, you come to the wrong therapist, because I am not the guru. You are your own internal person that can tell you what is truth for you. These principles of truth that they talk about, that they are very, very binary with, like, this is a distortion and this is truth. That's literally how they hold it up. It's either a distortion or it's truth. And that kind of brain mechanism creates a very, very black and white approach, worldview to the world, to yourself, So either you're completely an awful person, or you are the most wonderful moral person. You're one or the other. What are you? We don't know. But it takes a long time for people to come to themselves, right? Very vulnerable. And as a therapist, my training, like I was trained up in the Northwest, so I got the big orca energy of like all the liberals, okay? Like I got all my liberal training from up in the Pacific Northwest, and so everybody's afraid of me coming down here to Utah. Okay, here I am. But the fact is that you genuinely have to come and meet yourself, and it's a vulnerable experience to have to do that. And when you have people influencing you and becoming the new expert. And that is in all of the videos that I watched of Jodi. She was the person that had the truth. It was her. Yeah. And that is where inside of me, where then that like gets activated of that, oh, this is where the ethics get a little bit shaky for me right away. It's right away. I think, oh, this person is wanting to declare that they know something more than what their clients know. And the fact is I have nothing figured out more than my clients. Nothing figured out more than them. I have had years of training. I've had lots of ears. I've had lots of listening, but I don't know what's true for my clients. They know what's true for them. And sometimes it takes them a lot of time to work through some of the stuff that they've been given, and me too, right? I have to do the process too. It takes a long time for us to arrive to ourselves, but it's very important as a therapist not to be constantly trying to influence them to your truth. And that is therapy 101. We know that at the very beginning when we start ethics 101. We know that deeply in our training, and that is why training is important. And so right there, so that alone is where so then all of her things that she's saying about sexuality, because she says a lot of things that hurt my ears. she's saying a lot of things that hurt my ears. So it is really hard for her to be an authority out in the world and having influence, because it just, my whole body rejects it.
Yeah, let me touch on this. And as I'm touching on this, each of you think about some things that, I brought you on this podcast to really talk about kind of your area of expertise, because I'm going to kind of go through each of you as far as asking you some specific questions about that. But I think one of the things as a therapist that I have been challenged with a lot of what you just said, Amy, is that I do see myself as an expert. I have spent a lot of money and energy and training going and gathering the information, not my information, the information, right, in the general milieu. And I do think it is part of my responsibility as a therapist to offer some of that and what we call it psychoeducation. Psychoeducation can be a part of professional therapy work. But that's different than imposing my values. So let's take your masturbation example, for example, right? I may say, okay, well, we do know that there is research out there supporting, first of all, that most people masturbate. Second of all, that there's some benefits to it. And here's some of the benefits that we know it can help you with. It can help with sleep. It can help with chronic pain. It can help with desire discrepancies. Like, these are just some of the things that have come through the research. What I cannot do then is say, so you should masturbate. You should do that. Now I need to say, okay, I've presented you with some information. I'd like to know how that hits. I'd like to know what you think about that information. How does that information fit with your beliefs, with your values, with your relationship with the divine, if that's something that's important to you and your church community? And I've got to back up and let you sort out what that's going to mean for you. So there's two issues. One is that therapists are often giving misinformation. I'm like, stay in your flipping lane. If you're an eating disorders therapist, stick to that lane. If you're in child and adolescence, stick to that lane, right? If you're systemically trained, stick to that lane. So many therapists are, in particular, sharing much in regards to sexuality that they have not been trained about. So that's one thing, stick to your lane. And second of all, know the difference between psychoeducation and imposing your own values on a therapist. So given all of that, and I know that Julie has a hard stop at the top of the hour, I want to give you, Julie, a chance to just kind of be thinking about, so in particular, what are some particular things that Jodi, you've heard Jodi Hildebrandt say, or therapists similar to her, we don't have to necessarily stick to her, that hurt, like Amy says, hurt your ears as a therapist, as a clinician, because you feel like there's actual misinformation.
Oh yeah, around sexuality, I can tell you some.
I would say about anything that you feel.
Oh, anything.
Kind of the general practitioner here. You have some, you have some sexuality training, but you also kind of, I think, have this LDS perspective that you know very well because you've been working in that community so well. Like, what are some misinformation that you think your LDS folks might be vulnerable to that you're like, no, actually, I know better than that. I know better. So if you want to give sexual examples, great.
Well, I mean, it's so bad that even a non-sex therapist knows that it's not right or correct information, right?
Thank you for that.
Like that the internet and evil are trying to, make your child gay, and being LGBTQ is in distortion, which is not in truth. So there's one. Specifically, well, what stands out to me is just the constant black and white. There's no gray, right? So that's like therapy 101, cognitive distortion. Most things in life are gray. And so when you come from a high demand religion, a lot of things, it's good and evil. And good has to fight evil. And so I think that's really appealing to people who've been taught that in a religious context, because it's like, okay, this is familiar. This sounds true. Okay, am I in truth or distortion? Let's figure this out. And then the principles of truth are humility, responsibility, and honesty. Those are like the three main principles. Well, those are found in the scriptures, right? And so it's like, okay, this all feels really familiar, but it's presented in this rigid binary way that just feeds orthodoxy and rigid compliance. And as a therapist, like you were saying, Natasha, my goal is to help people find themselves, find their truth, find what resonates for them, not to say these are the 3 most important principles that you could ever have, and this is the way to look at it. And so I think that's kind of just a blanket problem with all of the content that those two have put out.
Yes, absolutely. And I think just staying with mental health, like you, I think had mentioned some of these ideas around depression, or like what causes depression, how do you treat depression? So something is very, I mean, most of us that have been trained in therapy can see somebody who's dealing with clinical depression, right? Or clinical anxiety disorder, and many of us work with PTSD. And so we're qualified to work with those issues. And yet some of the ways that those things are being talked about are just very dismissive and quite frankly dangerous, because you mentioned that eating disorders are like high mortality rates. So is depression, with suicidality. And if you're thinking, oh my goodness, I followed the principles of truth and honesty and whatever, and I'm still depressed, because we haven't really taken a clinically sound approach to that concern. Now guess who's blaming themselves usually?
Well, and they use the word agency. You have agency to decide how you perceive things and what you choose, and everything is a choice. So there's no acknowledgement of systemic factors that impact choices, or genetic factors. Everything is agency, is your choice, and it's up to you. And so, if you're suffering from health problems, like it's, and she also recommends cutting people off pretty frequently. Like if they're not living in truth, kick your kid out, or, and that's, in terms of relationally, that's just not usually the best course of action for families to cut each other off. In fact, in Bowennian family therapy, that's like a sign of low mental health, low differentiation, is just cutting someone out of your life. So, we could go on and on, but I'll let the others have a little chance.
Yeah, no, and I love that you bring the relational aspect, because actually one of the main things in most treatment plans for almost any consideration is, what's your support system like? Who are your people? Who can you talk to about this, right? It's actually gathering support instead of, now I've got one less person in my life who I can go to, a parent or a spouse or something like that. All right, so Claire, what are your thoughts from that child and adolescent lens? And I'm going to circle back to something that you said earlier. It's kind of this, where I think the mom says, oh, now the child is a sex perpetrator. Or my anecdotal experience, I'm not exactly sure how much clinical evidence we have about this, and maybe you would know, but the more rigid and suppressed the sexuality is within a family system, the more leaky it gets, in my perspective. And where there's less outlets to be kind of developmentally appropriate, then developmentally inappropriate things happen between siblings, between step-parents, between parents. And people need to, I will say this forever and ever, and I'll repeat it as many times, sexual abuse happens primarily within family and community systems, right? Primarily. It's not the stranger danger stuff. That happens and that's horrific, but it's not where it's majorly happening. So what are some of the truths that you are hearing from this truth distortion paradigm that just hurts your ears as a child and adolescent specialist when you're looking at some of their parenting thoughts and their ideas about childhood development and their expectations of certain children at certain ages? Take it away.
Do you have a couple hours?
I know. I should probably just interview you just for 3 hours.
For reals. Oh. So what I would hope is that their listeners, their followers, the people who have been curious or think that there's like some gems in the parenting approach, withholding love, withholding physical affection, withholding physical needs like food, shelter, safety, just the core basics, is never going to lead to positive relationship. and that's not going to lead to positive changes in your child. It's not going to lead to anything except further resentment and hurt and estrangement. And I think, unfortunately, with this case, you see that as soon as the children could emancipate and leave, there was no coming back, with the older siblings. And, the other side of this is it takes two. And so right now the mom is getting, like, she's the one in jail, her partner, her business partner's the one in jail. And I'm sorry, but there was another able-bodied adult in that house while these things were happening who was participating openly and freely online. And there should be another parent who's being held to the same standards and same consequences. But going back to some of these misconceptions, so one of the things that we know that's actually research-based, that's evidence-based, there is tons and tons and tons of research that you can find all over, is actually positive reinforcement, physical connection, attunement. Those are the game changers in changing behaviors and in changing unwanted behaviors with your children. And so taking away somebody's bed, refusing to give them food, refusing to let them go to school as a punishment, that is child abuse. Like, we have laws against that. That constitutes neglect. And so any of these parenting practices or suggestions that these two women have been, putting out to the world, this is considered abusive parenting. And it's not going to bring any goodness into your home to parent in these ways. And I think I can't imagine that there aren't therapists who are their followers who are parents too, thinking like, oh, I'm looking for truth. I'm looking for help. I'm looking for certainty in my life. And thinking like, oh, this is a great thing. I should suggest this to my clients. Or this trickle out piece is enormous. And I think too, this is where we have ethical guidelines that we have to stand behind if we be a therapist, and practice in ethical ways. But, I think if it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, it often is a duck, and if it feels off, if it feels yucky inside, or you're parenting in the way of I don't like this, trust that voice inside. Or if you're looking at your kid and they tell you, saying a prayer, I pray that I'm going to survive this, that should be a big red flag that something is not going right. And it's not cute and it's not funny. And shaming your child on social media for, praying in those ways, that should be a good indicator. I, as the adult, actually have responsibility into changing the behaviors of me. And I am responsible for the environment of my home, not my little kids. That is the grown-up's responsibility.
Yeah, I think historically, I'm not sure if I'm getting this wrong, but it seems like there was a tough love movement that maybe came out of the social justice arena of the 60s and the 70s and the hippie movement and the sexual revolution movement and, sex, drugs, and rock and roll type of stuff. And then, of course, the HIV epidemic hit, and there was all this fear and, scary stuff. And so tough love, and it's even kind of scripturally based, right? This whole spare the rod, spoil the child, and they really, both of these women really kind of used that kind of line of thinking, you're not doing your children any favors by letting them get away with bad behavior. And I think that's very seductive. I think that's a very seductive, especially when you're feeling that fear and that love and wanting to have your kids go in the right path, whatever you think that is for your kid, right? Which of course, that's another issue as we project all of our own ideas and dreams and goals onto our children instead of just figuring out our own life and dreams and goals and aspirations.
Right.
So what would you have to say about that? Yeah.
Well, and so much of this behavioral modification, this tough love, actually really took root in the late 90s, early 2000s in the adoption world. And when everybody had reactive attachment disorder. And this was how adoptive parents were being trained to circumvent some of the unwanted behaviors from this disorder. So if they're not going to respect your house, take away their bed. If they're not going to respect your clothes, take away their clothes. If they're not going to, talk nicely to you, take away their door and their privacy. I mean, these were things that were actually common in, especially in the adoption world. And, and so like, there's like the church, like the dogma piece that Jodi was, spouting off, but as well as mixed in with this, like we have a history of promoting these behaviors in the field of mental health. As abhorrent as they are, they've gone in and out of vogue in, like you talk about from like the 60s and even before then. And so it usually is, that leader or the leader in that community where they're able to have this grandiosity around them, and they develop a cult-like following and they can do no wrong. And then it becomes more and more extreme. But we've seen this across history in our field. Like, it's not something new that's happening. It's just, this is the newest example of somebody getting caught. And I think it's easy to forget that this happens, and it happens more often than we would like to acknowledge. But when this is happening and when this kind of thinking takes root, the most vulnerable people are the ones that get hurt. And these are the kids who die, and these literally at the hands of their parents. These are the kids that get sent away to atrocious conditions in different wilderness survival camps. And, it just goes on and on with that. And again, it's coming from that place of somebody tell me what to do because I don't know how to do this anymore, and not having any voice or trusting yourself as a parent. And, to be like, you can have all the knowledge in the world, and being a parent is the hardest thing that you do. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've cried myself to sleep as a parent, right? When I'm supposed to know everything. And you still can't.
You put a pandemic on that too, and it's been rough. It's been some rough parenting years. Yeah,
absolutely. And so I think that it's like this perfect breeding ground for this cult-like following of like, oh, there's truth. There's something that I can do, and it's black and white. Like, oh, this makes so much sense, and it gives me, okay, I can breathe because I have a plan. Because we, as parents, we can have the best plan and the best idea. And then your kid's like, yeah, I'm not going to do it. So see you later. I'm not coming home at curfew. Not that ever has happened in my own home,
Oh,
but,
me neither.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think it's just, there's so much of this where, if I could like shout it from the rooftops, it's like, trust your parent self, trust your mama heart, trust your dad heart. Like, if something is off, when you got to look at the mirror and figure out, what am I putting out here? Because that's my responsibility. And the other part of that is, what are the things that I can control? And am I engaging in ways of trying to control my child that is to their detriment, even if I'm trying to do it like to protect you? But hurting your kids is never, never going to lead to positive outcomes.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to move to Amy, but Julie, did you want to share any last thoughts before you need to leave us?
No, I'm just sad to miss out on the rest of the conversation. I appreciate all of your insights, and I love being part of this conversation, and hopefully we can prevent and educate and help people, not get into this situation ever again. So thank you for hosting us, Natasha.
And for being willing to spend this time with us, because I think it is in the community that we can really have a
heal
voice. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Julie.
Hey, thank you.
So really quickly, before I move to Amy, one of the things Claire said, which I think is important, because sometimes philosophies or parenting approaches or theories do come into pop psychology, kind of have a wave, have a chapter in our history that quite frankly are not great. I mean, lobotomies were not great, like we have, just because I definitely respect our field, and I think we have a lot of really great information that over the years we've gathered, and that scientific method is very helpful because we're accountable to it on a regular basis, and we're accountable to each other. Like, you come up with an idea, there's gonna be 10 therapists who disagree with you, right? So I think eventually those things get worked out, but there may be times where people have gotten not so great advice, not so great information on how to parent, how to manage sexuality, how to, manage mental health. And so I just want to call that out. I don't know that we have a solution to that, because I can see people saying, well, see, it's not like psychology has it all figured out. I'd rather trust God and my religious leaders and, the eternal truths, right? But we also, I just wanted to point out that the history of religion has just as much, if not more, kind of sadness and atrocities related to it. Just look at the Dark Ages, or any times there was torture used, in kind of dungeons of big churches, etc. I mean, humans in general don't have a great history, regardless. But the idea is that hopefully we're improving. And now throughout the last 50, 70 years, we actually do have a lot of replicable.
Yeah.
Just because I have a theory and I have one study where I found this out, if it's true, if there's truth to it, if there's effectiveness about it, it's going to be replicable, in other studies. And that's how these theories kind of come and go. And the ones that stay usually tend to be pretty good. Anyway, so you've done a great job with the child and adolescents. I mean, I'm sure you could choose 500 things to think about sexually, but in particular, Jodi Hildebrandt, and this is how I came to know of her, because I work very much with the pornography wound within conservative cultures. This was an area that she felt she had a lot of ideas and expertise on. So Amy, take it away as far as things that have hurt your ears in regards to sexual misinformation that has damaged so many marriages and relationships and individual lives, that we have had to clean up a lot of that mess.
Yeah. I talk a lot about how in each human person, there is this part of us that is our little sexual part, that it grows over time. And, it's this delicate one, beautiful part of every single human, right? And when that is violated at a young age with abuse, or with also verbal things that are getting planted in there, it creates a little tender sexual part of ourselves that gets violated, and it's sad, right? And in my work, part of the training for becoming an ASEX certified sex therapist, you have to learn how to do sexual history intakes. And I taught at Antioch, and I would on the sex history, when we would get to that topic, and that part of that learning, that training that we would get, we would talk so specifically about how you do that work, how you ask questions, how you present the information, and how you receive the information. And it's a skill that you have to learn very tenderly, and it is a tender place to go with people. It's a very tender place to go with people. So when you start putting information out, some of the things that I heard just in the brief things, namely, we want to talk about how people think of themselves at the core. And when you think that your sexuality is either a distortion or the truth, even that concept of black and white thinking so deeply about thinking sexuality, either I am a distortion if I do have feelings about, wow, that those boobs look good, or any kind of sexual thought that might pop up, a very natural human, the human part of our sexuality that pops up is automatically met with shame. It's automatically met with your distortion, that is evil. It's so black and white. Then what quickly ends up happening, that Natasha and I have seen very much, because we've had lots of conversations about this, is that because of the fact that Bishop's interviews, and there's a lot of talk about sexuality when you're moving through puberty, those vital years, it really creates people to be out of alignment with how they can communicate and how they can know themselves sexually. So, Julie had mentioned it before about this lack of development. When we think about a sexual soul or a sexual person and their development, we need to take that seriously as parents. We need to take it seriously. It's a big calling that we have when we are stewards of these humans. We have to teach them things like, here's how you brush your teeth, and here's how you go to bed, and here's how you be friends with people, and here's how you do life and relationships, and here's how you do And here's how you learn about this part of yourself that is part of you. So I mean, there are so many other problems, but what I want to namely say is that core wound in people that we have been right up close with and doing years and years of therapy with people around these stories. It is sad down there. Everybody, like, this is like a canary in the mine. Like Natasha, so many people of us that have been working with people in the wound of Mormon and sexuality and LDSness and sexuality, whatever label you want to identify yourself with, is like, there's a lot of pain in there. There's a lot of hard things happening for people in their humanity, right? And it has hurt my eyes to see for so many years how that has impacted people. I have tried, like my big sister Natasha is out there screaming, and she gets excommunicated, and it's like, that like lit a fire on me in ways that I can't really express, but to see colleagues trying to voice the things that we are all seeing so deeply and how important this work is. Like I take it, when I say I'm honored to be part of this profession, I am. It's an honor to be able to be with people in this. So I'm speaking to like self-therapists and what we have seen on the ground, like it is a lot of pain and suffering that we've had to hear and witness and try to like put holes in the places that it's like leaking out, and it's sad. We're sad and we're tired. And like, so then when you hear people that have influence and that have a platform and that have people that I know personally impacted from the lessons of parenting that they got from the Moms Connect, right? And I want to say something. Claire, you made a great point. What's the conversation about the dads here? Hello. I don't know the history of any of that, but like, wow, what about the conversations around the other humans that are supposed to be co-parenting in this? We haven't heard much on the internet, but you know what? It's easy to be very critical of the moms in there. I want to point that out. Second thing I want to point out, I'm sorry, Natasha, now you got me mad. Okay. I was always afraid of what I was saying publicly because I was afraid of the eyes of that were coming to get me. Okay. Well, they got Natasha, right? Didn't want that to happen to me. Did anybody call Jodi in? Did Jodi have any disciplinary action for the things that she was saying publicly? Because I was always afraid that I was going to get called in. And then I did. So many times I had general authorities in my room at my house personally talking to me about certain policies that had unfolded, right? Was there anybody talking to bishops about the abuse that was happening? They care a lot about a lot of different private personal things in people's lives, but was there any reports about child abuse happening in this family? It seems like Julie herself was calling Doppel reporting it. Were people reporting to the bishops? It's just questions I have. It's like curiosities I have. I don't know any of the answers, but it's just interesting that in a climate that the church does get involved sometimes when things matters like this. Okay. And what we've seen with confidentiality around bishops reporting things, this is where also I get really kind of fired up about how we are protecting not reporting with the bishops and the clergies. So just want to say that gets me fired up too. Okay.
Yeah, well, yeah, no, you're right. It's not reporting. It's reporting the therapists who might have a different perspective than the church is comfortable with, and why so many people like Jodi Hildebrandt get away with, I think, these kind of unethical things. And my call, and maybe this is too strong, so you all can, give me your own perspectives, but my call is that if we're going to be in the mental health professions, we have to be willing to do our own work. And although I may have a right to my own belief systems as a therapist, if you are, for example, bringing those belief systems like masturbation is a sin, being gay is a sin, being transgender is a sin, being anything but monogamously, partnered and sexual behavior, it can only be healthy in a committed marital long-term relationship. Otherwise, it's a sin. You are doing unethical work, because that may work for you in your life and that may work for you in your belief system, but you're not doing the work as a therapist to put that aside for the great diversity of values and belief systems and how sexual representation shows up in the human family, including other religions and other cultures and other ethnicities that have very different ideas than American Christian ideas around sexuality. So to me, and this is where too, I try to, on the one hand, I want to be respectful of other therapists. I want to understand where they're coming from. At the same time, I just want to say that as I was going through sex therapy training as a white Mormon girl, nobody really gave a freak about my feelings. Nobody was like, oh, are we hurting the white Mormon girl in the room by telling her sexual truths and evidence-based ideas? Nobody cared. In fact, they kind of looked at me a little bit like with a little bit of caution, because they probably assumed that I did have some of those harmful beliefs. And how was I going to then show up in community practice and affect other people who are really hurting? And the issue here is that the minorities, the gender minorities, the sexual minorities, the sexual behavior minorities in our community are growing up in these spaces where they don't just show up as 24-year-olds who are able to stand up for themselves. They're showing up in spaces where they're hearing this rhetoric from the professionals, from the clergy, from their parents, that they are less than, that they are broken, that they are not okay. And if we don't speak up, if we're not willing to take that risk that I took, I believe we're being unethical, complicit therapists. So that's my soapbox. And you can both disagree with me if you'd like.
I wholeheartedly agree with that statement. And I think that, especially in Utah, where we have some of the highest rates of youth homelessness, of LGBTQIA plus adolescents getting kicked out of their homes because of their own, either their sexuality or their perceived sexuality. We have the highest rates of suicide within that population. We have some work to do. And if it's not coming from us, and if we're not using our voice for the voiceless, then again, we got to look in the mirror and ask ourselves why. So I think that you're spot on with that. And there's so much to unpack around this.
Yeah, it's true. And I know I've made those mistakes. I did not show up as a 25-year-old therapist, which is when I graduated from therapy school, having all of this figured out. I made a lot of mistakes. I had to learn the hard way. I just presented at UAMFT around this topic of using my professional career in all the ways that I had to face bias and stereotype, my biases and stereotypes towards others, and have to shift how I was doing my clinical work. And, it was really a torn room. I mean, the feedback I got was like half the people loved what I had to say and half the people kind of hated what I had to say. It wasn't like really, I didn't get any in between. So that's interesting, just as a conglomerate here in Utah in particular. And I saw this as well with my evangelical colleagues in Wichita, Kansas, that some know how to do that work and separate their religious identity from their professional identity, but many of us do not. And I include myself in the earlier years in that. And I'm consistently having to watch that, even now, wherever I'm at now, because I can still impose my ideas, if I'm not too careful. Amy.
Well, I was just going to say that, and that is signs of a therapist that is not stagnant, right? Like, we are evolving as therapists, and the research evolves and science evolves, and we learn more and we get more information. And so of course there has to be self-reflection. And if there can't be self-reflection, then what's the point? And what is the job, right? And so we have to be accountable to what our job is and how we can change and how we can be better. One of the things that I've appreciated most about Natasha started the Mormon Mental Health Association, which is a group of clinicians that care about the mental health of people all across the spectrum. And it has always been where we've been talking about ethical issues over the years. We just had our 10th year, and it's a place where ethics are not as black and white as everybody thinks. Like, there have been to ethics trainings where we break up into groups. We all have the same exact ethical dilemma. Everybody stands up and they would handle the ethical dilemma differently. There's some ethics that are very clear, that are very black and white, but most of the time there's these complicated things that are coming up all the time that are happening. And then when you have the niche of a Latter-day Saint kind of situation, there's even more nuance and niche to even that. And so constantly be thinking about our own biases is something that is part of our training, that we constantly need to be checking our bias. We need to be accountable to the power that we hold and holding that space with people. And it's important that we do that. So I appreciate the influence, Natasha, that you've always had at putting the fire to the ethics. And I really appreciate that. And it's been something that you've modeled, and I've really gained a lot from it. And it's been beautiful to have in the profession. So you've offered that. And I want to say, I see you in that. And I've seen you doing that for all the years of bringing and talking about uncomfortable conversations, right? It's part of your magic. It's part of what you're good at, Natasha. And I've really, we've all benefited from it, the people that can be in that conversation. So
Thank you, Amy. That's
even
lovely.
today, this is a good conversation for us to keep
A great conversation. Yeah, I could keep it up. But on that note, we are kind of at time. So I want to give you both kind of just a chance to share whatever you'd like to share as final thoughts, right? So whether it's something that you feel like I didn't have a chance to ask you today and you were hoping to express that, or just kind of thinking through kind of your final ideas of what you want to say about this topic. So Claire, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I would just say, if something feels off, trust that inside. Amy, I know that you'd asked, like, apparently doing like my little internet sleuthing around this, there have been several CPS calls over the years about this family. Nothing came of it. And we know that we have broken systems, but I think, if you see a kid and you're like, something is off, this kid is hurt, or he's being hurt, or something's not right, like, trust yourself. And again, be a voice for the voiceless. It's come out, so many neighbors have been worried and concerned. Some have called the police on this family before. Many, I think, were worried and concerned and being quiet. And, you just have to think, like, if enough people could have trusted that, like, something is off, this feels yucky, I'm seeing signs of abuse, I'm seeing signs of something is not right happening here, and we're brave enough to use our voice, like, it may not have gotten to this point. We know that we have broken systems that's a whole nother conversation, holy cow, in our bureaucracies and how CPS and DCFS operate, and the police and everything else, and there's layers of privilege. But I think there's that other part too, where, I think, trust your parent heart, the parents who are listening to this, like, trust your gut. And when things feel out of control and you're looking for any type of light in the darkness, I think be skeptical of someone who says, here's the magic solution. Because the reality is that there isn't one. And parenting is not for the faint of heart. Holy cow, but there are resources and support systems available to you. And I think that it's easy to listen to the TikTok doctors who are not doctors. And they may have lots of letters after their names, like it's kind of the alphabet soup. And it's like, oh, they must know what they're talking about. But I think when someone's presenting binary information, there's black and there's white, there's up and there's down, there's in and there's out. I would say be cautious about that, because any parenting expert in the field is going to talk a lot about the grays and a lot about the things that you need to be looking at inside of you, and not just focusing on the behavior of the kids. And that's harder work, and that work sucks, and it's painful. And it's so important that we do it. And so, I think that, like, that would be like my little soapbox to end on. But I think it's listening to your gut, and when it feels off, it usually is.
I love that. And I think what you're also kind of implying, maybe indirectly, is critical thinking work. Like, not maybe just trust one source, like if let's say you had listened to these ideas, what does your pediatrician think about those ideas? What does your mother think about those ideas? What does your best friend think about those ideas? What do 3 other experts in the field think about that idea? Like, gather a medley of information, and usually things that are helpful come from more than one source.
Yes.
And don't just look in your own community either, because like I said, if you're a religiously inclined community and you're Catholic and all the Catholics think this, you're probably not going to find other ideas, right? Or Muslims or Jewish folks, right? And so look outside of your community and see, how are other folks thinking about these kinds of issues, and how does that align with kind of the thoughts or advice I'm getting here. So I love that, Claire. Thank you so much. And thank you for your time. And just to remind people that Claire's at Wasatch Family Therapy. And so you can reach her that way. Is there anything else you'd like to say as far as anything you're working on or ways that you can be contacted?
Yeah, I mean, people can always find me online. Speaking of finding people online, the clairemelantine.com and then Claire Melantine Play Therapy on Instagram. But I think that, you know, I'm grateful we're having these conversations, and it's just heartbreaking that it had to stem from such a horrific event happening. But this is one home and one family. This is happening all over the place. And I think that that's where it is so important, you know, to use that critical thinking. And it's easy, like we are creatures of comfort. So we seek out what's comfortable and known, and looking beyond that is scary. And it's uncomfortable, but you know, Natasha, like you said, it's so crucial that we do, so that we can show up as our best selves in the ways that we can.
Yeah, and a plug for play therapy. Do you know why we have specialists in play therapy? Because up to a certain developmental level, children are not going to have the developmental maturity or processing skills to be able to verbally sit with somebody and talk about their problems. Kids do this through play, which just gives me a whole nother lieu of memories of things that, you know, Ruby was talking about with her children that just were so developmentally inappropriate, holding them to some adult standard of behavior or even emotional regulation. And that's why we have so many folks doing amazing work by getting trained and specialized in play therapy and even adolescent work. So thank you for the work that you're doing for our community, Claire.
Thanks. And I think just my ending little thought, as a parent, you have to ask yourself, am I trying to teach my child or am I trying to punish my child? And if you're trying to punish your child, you're going to follow this paradigm shift. But if you're trying to teach your child, what are they going to learn by withholding food? What are they going to learn from being harmed physically? What are they going to learn from these adult behaviors that you're doing? And so that's something that, you know, I just kind of leave with my parents too, that I work with. Like, you just got to keep asking yourself, in this moment, am I trying to teach my child or am I trying to punish my child? And there's lots of times we want to punish our kids. We're mad, we're hurt, we're frustrated. And that's not showing up in our best selves when we do that.
And quite frankly, it's a lot of how we were parented. So sometimes we
Absolutely.
don't know. That's why we have to do our own shadow work and our own work, even from people we feel we're loving parents. We may have good relationships with our parents. That doesn't mean that they parented us well, because they were also parented in atrocious ways, right? And so oftentimes when you're in those moments of stress and not knowing what to do, you revert back to what you know, because that's how you were parented. And so I think there's just a lot here. That's why, yeah, being a parent is a lot. And I hope we all have grace for each other as we're trying to
Yes.
figure it all out.
No, I think most of us, we're kind of like being dropped off on like Naked and Afraid, right? Especially if you're like being like the change maker of your family. And it's like, I have no tools, I have no map, I have no clothes. Like, how am I going to do this?
Yeah. Yeah, they're gonna have to take me off the show in 90 days because I've gone a little bit wonky. So, but there's no getting off the show.
Right. That's life. So seek out good tools.
Yes. Thank you. Amy,
Thanks
what are
so
your
much.
what are your
Okay.
final thoughts?
Beautiful. Claire's were beautiful too. And so I love being a part of this conversation. I guess my last thing to say is that when we're looking at generational healing and generational trauma and generational joy and all those things, and big LDS families and Mormon families, we got a lot of kids. Like, family is something that has been so central to the core values of the people, right? And so I know that these people are real people, like the Frankies and the Hildebrandts. They have families, they have people and friends in their life and the kids are real humans that are going to have to actually deal with this. So we can talk about this all loosely, but I just want to offer like love to the families that are going to have to deal with a lot of like what's in front of them. And so like genuine compassion, Claire mentioned it at the beginning. And I want to circle back to that. Like, this is generational trauma unfolding before our eyes. Okay. There is a very there is a lot to look at here systemically on how a lot of the information that they give is presented and parallels to how then we just learn how to parent that way, right? And so a lot of times being that change maker that Claire brought up, being that person that kind of absorbs some of that generational pain that says this way of doing parenting, this like not teaching led, or it's a shame led, it's a fear-based way to lead parenting. And it's like, what we need to shift to is much more of this, like, you know, it's a love-based leading of parenting, and it's different than how we were raised in like, I mean, I was raised Mormon, and I was raised a very, very liberal parents, so I have a very different little perspective, because my parents were like weird progressive weirdos, hippie, like they're the hippiest little hippies. So I had a different, but I saw with my eyes how parenting was different. And I could tell that my parents received a lot of criticism from the community about how they were parenting. So this is a shift. It's a shift to have like love-led parenting and like curiosity-led parenting. And so I just want to offer the people that were genuinely impacted by this, I just want to offer them some strength and like inner authority, start turning that up. It's hard work to look at how the generations above you, how your parents influenced where you're at, and how to unpack all that. It's hard work, and it's worth it. It's fun work. It's hard work. And I think people like have to look at that. And I guess I would just say those final thoughts is that family is hard. We don't get some recipe to figure out how to do it, right? But we are, you know, we're here and we have families. We have family of origins. We have our own families that we create. And it's just important to have your own internal authority. And I can see that a lot of this is rooted in people just looking for authority. And I just offer love to the whole people, like really, because it's the generational trauma that we see all the time as therapists, but it's just on display for the consumption of the internet, you know, because they've put themselves in a place where they've done that, you know. So, and I'm not being critical of that. I'm just saying it's easy for us to be able to criticize and to analyze this because they've put themselves out there so much in the world, you know. So
yeah,
love to the people, empathy. We're all just trying to figure out the generational trauma, but abuse isn't okay. And we can speak up to that. And as therapists in the collective that hear about the abuse happening, we need to be accountable to speak up to that. And this is an exact situation that I'm proud to hear that there was a lot of CPS reports. That makes me happy to hear that, you know?
Yeah. One thing I'll just say very briefly, because you can probably go listen to 500 other podcasts that I've done on the topic, but when I mentioned, you know, masturbation and, you know, all these things, I was like, you can't bring these belief systems. One thing that Jodi Hildebrandt was very much a part of was the sex addictions movement and treatment, which is ineffective. And that is very much, you know, causing harm. So that's another area we really need to be very critical of, especially in religiously conservative communities, which are most vulnerable to that kind of treatment approach, because that's been shown by the research to be the case. I also want to role model learning from one of my own colleagues who made a comment. So Stacy Jackson Roberts says, I have trouble with the word expert, which I called myself earlier, as it seems to center therapists and their power and an arrived state. I prefer specialist. This is my area of focus and constant learning, and also centers the patient or the client. So I really appreciate that. I love learning language differences, different language we can use to be even more inclusive, more aware. Usually how I have said is, I'm an expert in a field, you're the expert in your own life. So that's how I've tried to talk to my clients about it, but I'm going to try to use the word specialist or, you know, something along those lines, because we do want to be very wary of that power differential that Claire brought up so well earlier on, that the therapist is all knowing and that you are the client who comes in. You know, that's not what therapy is about. Therapy is, I'm supposed to be a processor, a curious explorer with you, but you are the genuine authority of your own life. So no religious leader, no therapist, no coach, no educator should take that place of that you need to have within yourself. So thank you so much. I just have loved this discussion. You've all brought just beautiful truths and wisdom and collective wisdom to the table. And I hope that our paths meet very quickly again, since we're all here in this area. Have a good day, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, Natasha.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. No tishki say the no. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. No tishki shade the novel, so we can to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. No tishki shade the novel, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland